Pain has a way of lingering in places you don't expect. Not in the obvious moments, not in the dramatic scenes, but in the quiet ones. In the way your hand hesitates before reaching out. In the way you laugh a little too quickly when someone asks if you're okay. In the way you avoid mirrors on days when your own reflection feels like a stranger. I used to think wounds were things to fix, problems to solve, evidence of failure. I treated them like stains on a shirt, something to scrub out, hide, or replace. I didn't know how to sit with them. I didn't know how to let them breathe. Most of my wounds weren't physical. They were made of silence, of things unsaid, of moments where I needed comfort and got confusion instead. I carried them in my posture, in my tone, in the way I always tried to make others feel safe while quietly unraveling inside. I remember being a child and learning early that tears made people uncomfortable. That sadness was something to be managed, not met. I became good at swallowing emotion, at turning grief into politeness, at smiling through the ache. Later, as I grew older, I mistook numbness for strength. I thought if I didn't feel, I couldn't be hurt. I built walls, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. I didn't want to explain myself anymore. I didn't want to be misunderstood again. So I stopped trying. But wounds don't disappear just because you ignore them. They wait. Patiently. Quietly. They show up in relationships, in choices, in the way you flinch when someone gets too close. They speak through avoidance, through overthinking, through the constant need to prove you're okay. I didn't realize how many wounds I was carrying until I found myself alone one evening, sitting in my apartment, surrounded by silence. There was no crisis, no heartbreak, just stillness. And in that stillness, something cracked. I looked around and saw the evidence of my own neglect. Half-written poems, unanswered messages, a pile of laundry I kept avoiding, a notebook with pages torn out. It wasn't chaos. It was quiet grief, the kind that accumulates when you keep choosing others over yourself. That night, I didn't try to fix anything. I didn't clean. I didn't write. I just sat. And for the first time, I let the ache rise. I didn't push it down. I didn't rationalize it. I didn't shame it. I just let it be. It felt like failure. But it wasn't. It was truth. In the days that followed, I began to notice the ways I had been hiding. Not just from others, but from myself. I saw how often I used humor to deflect. How I avoided vulnerability by staying busy. How I kept people at a distance, even when I craved closeness. I started asking myself questions I had long avoided. What am I afraid of? What am I grieving? What parts of me have I abandoned? The answers weren't immediate. They came slowly, like fog lifting. I realized I was grieving more than lost relationships. I was grieving the version of myself I never got to be. The child who needed softness and got silence. The teenager who needed guidance and got guilt. The adult who kept performing strength because he didn't know how to ask for help. I began to write again. Not for clarity. Not for beauty. Just for honesty. I wrote about the moments that hurt. The ones I never spoke of. The ones I thought didn't matter. I wrote about the time I felt invisible in a room full of people. About the time I said, "I'm fine," and wanted someone to say, "I don't believe you." About the time I stayed in a relationship that made me feel small because I thought smallness was safer than solitude. Each word felt like a release. Not a cure, but a recognition. Accepting my wounds didn't mean celebrating them. It didn't mean turning pain into poetry or making suffering noble. It meant acknowledging that they existed, that they shaped me, that they deserved attention. I stopped trying to be healed. I started trying to be honest. I let myself cry without explanation. I let myself rest without guilt. I let myself feel without editing. I began to understand that wounds aren't weaknesses. They're stories. They're evidence of survival. They're reminders that I've lived, that I've risked, that I've cared. And slowly, I stopped hiding. Not from others. From myself. That's where this part ends. Not with resolution. Not with healing. But with the first step toward truth. Valentin is beginning to see his wounds not as shame, but as signals. Not as flaws, but as facts. And that shift, quiet, uncomfortable, real, is the beginning of acceptance. Wounds don't announce themselves. They don't knock on the door and say, "I'm here." They slip into the rhythm of your life, unnoticed at first. They shape the way you answer questions, the way you walk into rooms, the way you interpret silence. I didn't realize how much of my daily life was built around avoiding pain until I started paying attention. It was in the way I hesitated before sending a message, afraid of being too much. In the way I reread texts before replying, trying to sound light, agreeable, easy. In the way I said yes to things that drained me, just to avoid disappointing someone. I thought I was being kind, thought I was being flexible. But really, I was negotiating with my wounds, trying to keep them quiet, trying to keep myself small. I began to notice how often I apologized. Not for mistakes, but for existing. Sorry for the long message. Sorry if this is weird. Sorry I didn't respond sooner. Each apology was a thread, woven from the belief that my presence was a burden. That my feelings were inconvenient. That my needs were too loud. And it wasn't just in words. It was in posture, in tone, in the way I'd lean away when someone got too close emotionally. I'd nod and smile, even when I disagreed. I'd laugh at jokes that made me uncomfortable. I'd offer help when I was exhausted. I'd say, "I'm fine," when I wasn't. These weren't habits. They were survival strategies. Learned responses to a world that didn't always know how to hold tenderness. I had trained myself to be digestible, to be safe, to be quiet. But the cost was high. I began to feel disconnected from myself. Not dramatically, just subtly. Like I was watching my life from a few steps back. Like I was performing a version of myself that others found acceptable, while the real me waited patiently in the wings. One morning, I woke up and felt a heaviness I couldn't name. I hadn't fought with anyone. Nothing had gone wrong. But I felt hollow. Like something inside me had gone missing. I made tea, sat by the window, and tried to trace the feeling. It wasn't sadness. It was absence. The absence of self. The absence that comes from years of self-abandonment. From choosing peace over truth. From choosing others over myself. I didn't try to fix it. I just sat with it. And slowly, the feeling began to speak. It said, "You've been gone a long time." That day, I moved slower. I didn't force productivity. I didn't chase clarity. I just let myself be. I noticed the way the light hit the wall. The way the tea tasted slightly bitter. The way my breath felt tight in my chest. I didn't judge it. I didn't analyze it. I just witnessed it. And in that witnessing, something softened. I began to understand that accepting my wounds wasn't about solving them. It was about letting them exist. Letting them speak. Letting them be part of the story, not something to edit out. I started practicing presence. Not the kind that looks good on paper. The kind that feels awkward. The kind that requires patience. The kind that asks, "Can you stay with yourself, even when it hurts?" I began to notice how often I tried to escape discomfort. Through distraction. Through overthinking. Through caretaking others. And instead of escaping, I started staying. When I felt anxious, I didn't reach for my phone. I sat with the feeling. When I felt rejected, I didn't spiral into self-blame. I named the ache. When I felt unseen, I didn't perform louder. I whispered to myself, "I see you." It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. But it was real. I also began to see how my wounds shaped my relationships. How I chose people who needed me, but didn't know how to meet me. How I stayed in dynamics where I was the listener, the fixer, the safe space, but never the one held. I started asking myself, do I feel safe here? Not just physically. Emotionally. Energetically. Spiritually. And when the answer was no, I didn't force it. I didn't try to earn love. I didn't try to prove my worth. I just stepped back. Not out of anger. Out of self-respect. I began to build boundaries. Not walls. Boundaries. Gentle, clear, honest. I said, no, more often. I said, I need time. I said, I'm not available for that. And each time, I felt the tremble of old wounds. The fear of being abandoned. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of being alone. But I stayed with the tremble. I didn't run. I didn't betray myself. I stayed. And slowly, the tremble became trust. That's where this part ends. Not with healing. Not with closure. But with the quiet decision to remain present. Valentin is learning to live with his wounds, not as enemies, but as companions. Not as shame, but as truth. And that truth, though uncomfortable, is becoming a kind of home. There's a quiet shift that happens when you stop treating your wounds as secrets. The world doesn't change. People don't suddenly become gentler. But something inside you softens. You stop bracing. You stop rehearsing. You start living. I didn't notice it at first. It wasn't dramatic. Just small things. I stopped editing my messages to sound more cheerful. I stopped pretending I wasn't tired when I was. I stopped saying, I'm okay, when I wasn't. And the world didn't collapse. No one ran away. Some people even leaned in. I began to speak differently. Not louder. Not sharper. Just more honestly. I said things like, I'm feeling heavy today, or I need space, or that hurt. And each time, I felt the tremble of vulnerability. The old fear that honesty would cost me connection. But it didn't. At least not always. Some people didn't know how to respond. They changed the subject. They offered solutions. They got uncomfortable. And that was okay. I wasn't speaking for them. I was speaking for me. I started noticing who could meet me there. In the rawness. In the quiet. In the truth. Those people didn't flinch. They didn't fix. They listened. They stayed. And with them, I didn't have to perform. I could just be. That was new. I also began to care for myself differently. Not as a project. Not as a checklist. But as a relationship. I asked myself what I needed, not what I should do. I stopped chasing productivity. Stopped measuring my worth in output. I let myself rest. Let myself wander. Let myself feel. I created rituals. Not routines. Rituals. Small acts of presence. Lighting a candle before writing. Drinking tea slowly. Sitting by the window without a phone. These weren't tasks. They were offerings. Ways of saying, I'm here. I matter. I started writing letters I never sent. To people who hurt me. To people I missed. To versions of myself I had abandoned. I didn't write for closure. I wrote for clarity. For release. For recognition. One letter was to the boy I used to be, the one who thought silence was safety. I told him I was proud of him. Told him he did what he had to do. Told him he didn't fail. He survived. Another was to someone I loved deeply but lost. I didn't blame them. I didn't beg. I just said, I loved you. And I forgive both of us. Each letter was a wound made visible. And in making it visible, I made it less powerful. I began to see my wounds not as obstacles, but as invitations. They asked me to slow down. To listen. To soften. They taught me how to be present. How to be real. How to be kind. I stopped trying to be impressive. Stopped trying to be strong. I let myself be tender. Let myself be awkward. Let myself be unfinished. And in that space, I found connection. Not the kind built on performance. The kind built on truth. On shared humanity. On mutual care. I had a conversation with someone who had also been through loss. We didn't trade advice. We didn't compare pain. We just sat in it together. And that sitting, that quiet, unpolished presence, was more healing than any solution. I began to understand that healing isn't a destination. It's a way of being. A way of relating. A way of choosing. Choosing to stay. Choosing to feel. Choosing to speak. Choosing to care. I also began to notice how my wounds shaped my creativity. How the ache became a kind of ink. Not for drama. Not for attention. But for truth. I wrote stories that didn't resolve. Poems that didn't rhyme. Reflections that didn't teach. Just moments. Just feelings. Just life. And people responded. Not with applause. With recognition. With messages like, "I feel this," or "I thought I was the only one." That was enough. That was everything. I wasn't trying to inspire. I was trying to exist. And in existing, I made space for others to do the same. That's where this part ends. Not with triumph. Not with transformation. But with tenderness. Valentin is no longer hiding. No longer performing. He's living, with his wounds, not despite them. And in that living, he's finding something deeper than healing. He's finding truth. There's a moment when the pain stops asking for attention and simply becomes part of the landscape. Not because it's gone. Not because it's healed. But because it's been seen. Named. Honored. I didn't notice when that moment arrived. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It just settled in quietly, like a guest who finally feels welcome. I began to live differently. Not dramatically. Just more honestly. I no longer tried to hide the parts of me that felt too tender. I didn't rush to explain my quiet days. I didn't apologize for my sensitivity. I let myself be whole, even when that wholeness included ache. My wounds became part of my rhythm. They taught me how to move slowly, how to listen deeply, how to speak with care. They gave me a kind of emotional fluency I hadn't known before. I could feel the tremble in someone's voice and know what it meant. I could sit with someone's silence and not demand words. I could hold space without needing to fill it. I stopped trying to be the strong one. Stopped trying to be the healer. Stopped trying to be the one who always had the right words. I let myself be human. Let myself be tired. Let myself be unsure. And in that softness, I found connection. Not the kind built on performance. The kind built on presence. On mutual recognition. On shared vulnerability. I began to attract people who spoke the same language. People who didn't flinch at discomfort. Who didn't rush to fix. Who didn't need me to be anything other than real. With them, I didn't have to translate myself. I could just exist. That was new. That was sacred. I also began to notice how my wounds shaped my choices. Not as limitations. As guides. They taught me what mattered. What felt safe. What felt true. I no longer chased things that looked good on paper. I chased resonance. Depth. Meaning. I chose work that allowed me to be present. Chose spaces that honored slowness. Chose relationships that felt like home, not performance. I stopped trying to prove myself. Stopped trying to earn rest. Stopped trying to be impressive. I started asking different questions. Not what will they think, but does this feel right? Not will this make me successful, but will this make me whole? Not am I enough, but am I honest? And slowly, my life began to reflect those questions. It became quieter, richer, more rooted. I also began to speak to my wounds directly. Not with shame. With gratitude. I'd say things like, "Thank you for teaching me patience. Thank you for showing me where I need care. Thank you for reminding me I'm alive." It felt strange at first, but then it felt sacred. Like I was reclaiming something. Like I was rewriting the story. My wounds were no longer enemies. They were companions. They were evidence of love, of risk, of depth. They were reminders that I had felt deeply, cared fiercely, lived fully. I didn't need them to disappear. I needed them to be seen. And now they are. That's where this story settles. Not with a clean ending. Not with a perfect resolution. But with a quiet truth. Valentin has learned to accept his wounds. Not as flaws. Not as failures. But as roots. Roots that ground him. Roots that guide him. Roots that remind him who he is. He walks through the world differently now. not lighter, but steadier, not louder, but clearer, not healed, but whole. And that, in the end, is what support looks like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of self.